Flames tore through the roof of Shadow Lawn at 4:37 in the morning on June 10, 1927. The mansion had stood for 24 years on 8 acres of New Jersey oceanfront, 52 rooms rising 3 stories above manicured lawns that sloped toward the Atlantic. Water from West Long Branch's fire trucks could not reach the upper floors. The ocean wind pushed the blaze through wooden beams and plaster walls faster than crews could contain it. Firefighters watched helplessly as the flames consumed room after room, floor after floor. The heat was so intense that marble cracked in the entrance hall. Crystal chandeliers melted and crashed to the floors below. By dawn, nothing remained but limestone foundations blackened with soot and twisted steel beams pointing at the sky like broken fingers. The property had cost $1 million to build in 1903, the equivalent of $33 million today. Firefighters from 3 townships watched that fortune collapse into ash and rubble in less than 6 hours. The owner of the scorched land did not abandon the property. Within weeks, Hubert Templeton Parson purchased the ruins and hired Philadelphia's most expensive architect. He would rebuild, not restore. Rebuild completely, creating something far grander than what had burned. The new Shadow Lawn would cost $10.5 million, making it the most expensive private residence in America. Construction would take 18 months, finishing in spring of 1929, just months before the stock market collapsed and the Great Depression began erasing fortunes across the country. This is the story of 2 mansions built on the same plot of New Jersey shore. The first, built by an insurance executive brought down by scandal, a man who spent company funds on political influence until investigators exposed him and humiliation killed him within weeks. The second, built by a retail magnate who spent 18 months constructing a palace and 4 years enjoying it before death claimed him, and the Depression made his monument obsolete. Between these 2 owners, the house briefly became a presidential summer retreat where Woodrow Wilson ran his 1916 re-election campaign. Then it became an abandoned ruin stripped by vandals, marble torn from walls, chandeliers stolen, windows shattered. Finally, it became an educational institution that survives today, because no one could afford to tear it down. Before we discover what happened next, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if you enjoy stories of forgotten mansions and the fortunes that built them, subscribe to the channel. New videos every week exploring the estate's history left behind. That fire in 1927 was not the beginning of Shadow Lawn's story. To understand what burned that morning and why anyone would rebuild on cursed ground, we have to go back 24 years to a man who made his fortune selling something invisible. John Augustine McCall arrived in the world on April 2, 1849 in Albany, New York, the son of an Irish-American family whose name appeared in no social registers. His father worked steady but unremarkable employment. His mother managed the household with the careful economy that characterized families one step above poverty. Young John attended local schools but showed no interest in college. He wanted money, position, respect. The kind of respect that came from corner offices and summer estates. Not from modest Albany row houses where neighbors knew exactly how little your family possessed. In 1884, at 35 years old, he joined the New York Life Insurance Company as an agent. He sold policies door to door in Manhattan, collecting premiums from families who feared leaving widows and orphans destitute. The work required persistence and a particular kind of persuasion, convincing men to pay monthly for protection they hoped would never be needed. McCall discovered he had talent for both. He understood how life insurance functioned as both protection and investment, how policies gained value over time, how the mathematics of mortality tables and compound interest created profits for companies that managed risk properly. The company noticed his success. Within 3 years, he rose to supervisor. Within 5, he managed an entire district. By 1892, 8 years after joining as a street agent knocking on doors, John McCall became president of New York Life Insurance Company. He was 43 years old. The position transformed him from comfortable to wealthy. His salary reached $100,000 annually by 1905, the equivalent of $3 million today. But salary was only part of his compensation. Stock arrangements, bonuses, And the complex financial instruments that characterized Gilded Age executive packages multiplied his income several times over. McCall moved his family from their middle-class neighborhood to a Manhattan address that announced arrival. He joined the right clubs, the ones that had excluded Irish families a generation earlier. He cultivated relationships with politicians in Albany who could influence insurance regulation, relationships that required careful maintenance through contributions and favors. New York Life's assets grew under his leadership, expanding aggressively into new markets and new products. The company's reach extended across the country and internationally. McCall became one of the insurance industry's most powerful executives, commanding a company that held hundreds of millions of dollars in policyholder funds and wielded enormous influence in New York's political machinery. He spent company money on those political relationships without hesitation or documentation. This was standard practice in the industry. Every major insurance company maintained what they called lobbying expenses, funds used to ensure that legislators understood the industry's needs when drafting regulation. The accounting for these expenses was deliberately vague. Receipts disappeared. Payments went to intermediaries who distributed cash to politicians without creating records that connected the money to specific votes. McCall excelled at this game. He knew which Albany assemblymen needed campaign contributions and which preferred cash payments delivered in private. He understood that insurance regulation required constant attention, that the wrong law could cost the industry millions, that preventing bad legislation was worth substantial investment. In 1903, McCall decided his family needed a summer residence. Manhattan society decamped to Newport or the New Jersey shore each June, abandoning the city's heat for ocean breezes and elaborate entertaining. Staying in the city all summer marked you as someone who could not afford to leave, someone whose fortune was insufficient for maintaining multiple residences. McCall chose West Long Branch, a stretch of Atlantic coast where financiers and industrialists built what they called cottages. Though these structures contained dozens of rooms and required staffs of servants to operate. He purchased 8 acres of oceanfront property for a sum records do not clearly document, and commissioned a mansion in the neoclassical style that dominated turn-of-the-century American architecture. The house rose 3 stories, 52 rooms arranged around a central hall with a grand staircase that curved upward through all 3 floors. Imported marble lined the entrance, white stone with gray veining brought from quarries in Italy. Crystal chandeliers hung in the reception rooms, each one costing more than an average worker earned in a year. The dining room could seat 30 guests at a table of polished mahogany. The bedrooms featured ensuite bathrooms with porcelain fixtures and hot running water, luxuries that most Americans would not enjoy for another generation. The grounds featured formal gardens designed by a landscape architect who had trained in France, a greenhouse for cultivating exotic plants through New Jersey winters, and private beach access with a pavilion for changing into swimming costumes. McCall named the estate Shadow Lawn, either for the shadows cast by trees across the property or for reasons now lost to history. The total cost approached $1 million, the equivalent of $33 million today. Every detail announced wealth and taste. The floors were inlaid wood in geometric patterns. The walls were papered with silk imported from China. The fireplaces were marble, each mantel carved with different classical motifs. McCall hired a staff of 20 to maintain the property during the summer season: butler, housekeeper, cook, maids, footmen, gardeners, grooms for the stables. The estate operated like a small hotel, requiring constant labor to keep every surface polished and every garden bed planted. Shadow Lawn announced McCall's arrival among the elite. He entertained business associates there each summer, hosting dinners for politicians whose votes shaped insurance law and parties for executives who controlled competing companies. The mansion functioned as both pleasure palace and business tool, a place where deals were made over brandy on the terrace while orchestras played in the ballroom and wives gossiped in the gardens. McCall's wife managed the household, directing servants and planning menus and ensuring that every guest departed impressed by what the McCall family had achieved. His children enjoyed the beach, swimming in the Atlantic and exploring tide pools under the supervision of nannies. He enjoyed the respect that came from owning 8 acres of Atlantic shoreline, from being able to invite governors and senators to his home. from watching men who had once looked down on his Irish background now accept his hospitality and seek his favor. Shadow Lawn rose white and gleaming above the ocean in 1903. McCall had arrived. He had built his monument, but the foundation of his fortune, like the foundation of his mansion, rested on something more fragile than limestone and steel. It rested on the continued ignorance of policyholders and the public about where their money actually went. In 1905, the New York State Legislature began investigating the insurance industry. Public anger had been building for years over executive compensation packages that seemed disconnected from company performance and political contributions, that bought favorable legislation, while policyholders saw modest returns on their investments. Newspapers had run occasional exposés suggesting corruption, but the industry's power had prevented serious scrutiny. Then a particularly egregious scandal at Equitable Life triggered demands for comprehensive investigation. The Armstrong Investigation, named for the senator who chaired the committee, promised to expose corruption throughout the business. Charles Evans Hughes, a brilliant attorney who would later become Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, led the questioning. He was methodical, relentless, and unbribable. McCall's name appeared on the witness list. His stomach must have turned when he received the summons. Everything he had built depended on practices that looked very different under oath than they did in executive suites. The hearings opened in September of 1905 in a New York City courtroom packed with journalists and curious citizens. Hughes methodically dismantled the insurance industry's facade of respectability. He revealed that executives at multiple companies used policyholder funds as personal slush funds, paying themselves extraordinary salaries while investing company assets in schemes that benefited their own holdings. They funneled millions to Albany politicians who protected them from regulation. They created accounting systems deliberately designed to hide how money flowed and where it ended up. The testimony shocked the public. These were companies that ordinary people trusted with their life savings, with their families' futures. The betrayal felt personal. McCall's turn came in late autumn. Hughes had obtained New York Life's books. He had interviewed employees who kept the real records, the ones that showed where money actually went. He knew the truth before McCall took the stand. The questioning was precise and devastating. Under oath, McCall admitted that the company had paid over $1 million to political operatives in Albany over the previous several years. He could not, or would not, explain exactly how that money was spent. There were no receipts, no documentation of services rendered, just payments to intermediaries who presumably distributed the funds to politicians, though proving exactly which politicians received exactly how much was impossible by design. Hughes pressed harder. Had McCall used company funds for personal expenses? The evidence suggested yes. Though McCall tried to characterize certain expenditures as legitimate business costs, had he arranged for his son to receive compensation from New York Life without performing substantial work? The nepotism was clear in the employment records. Had he created accounting systems designed to hide lobbying expenses and personal expenditures from regulators and stockholders? McCall's answers satisfied no one. He equivocated. He claimed not to remember details. He suggested that other executives had made certain decisions. The performance was weak and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The newspapers covered every session. Headlines detailed the corruption in language that made insurance executives sound like common thieves. Editorial writers demanded reform, criminal prosecution, restitution to policyholders who had been cheated. The public, which had trusted these companies with their savings and their families' futures, felt betrayed. McCall became the face of insurance industry excess, his name synonymous with the kind of corporate corruption that characterized the era's worst impulses. Political cartoonists drew him as a fat cat stealing from widows and orphans. His fellow members at exclusive clubs began avoiding him. Invitations to social events dried up. The humiliation was public and complete. In January of 1906, New York Life's board forced him to resign. The vote was unanimous. They had no choice. The company's reputation was in tatters. Policyholders were threatening to cancel. Regulators were discussing new laws that would fundamentally change how the industry operated. McCall had become a liability, someone whose continued presence would destroy what remained of public trust. He was 56 years old. His career was finished, his reputation destroyed. Friends who had enjoyed his hospitality at Shadow Lawn, who had accepted his political contributions and his business favors, stopped returning calls. He became invisible, a man to be avoided lest his disgrace somehow transfer through association. The stress manifested physically. McCall developed kidney problems, the kind that doctors in 1906 could diagnose but not effectively treat. He weakened rapidly over the following weeks, his health collapsing as quickly as his reputation. Whether the kidney disease caused the stress or the stress triggered the kidney disease was impossible to determine, but everyone close to him understood that humiliation was killing him as surely as any physical ailment. On February 18, 1906, less than 2 months after his resignation, John Augustine McCall died at a hotel in Lakewood, New Jersey. The official cause was kidney disease, but everyone understood that stress and humiliation had killed him. He was 57 years old. The mansion he had built to announce his success became monument to his disgrace. His widow and heirs wanted nothing to do with the New Jersey shore or the memories attached to that property. Shadow Lawn represented everything that had gone wrong, the excess and arrogance that had brought their family low. They sold the estate within months, accepting whatever price they could get just to be rid of it. Joseph B. Greenhut knew what to do with disgraced property. The department store magnate had built his fortune buying troubled businesses and making them profitable again. When Shadow Lawn came on the market at a fraction of its construction cost, Greenhut saw opportunity where others saw scandal. The house itself was sound, well built with quality materials that would last for decades. The location remained prime real estate, oceanfront, in an established wealthy enclave. The scandal that destroyed McCall would eventually fade from memory. People would forget the corruption and remember only the beautiful mansion on the shore. Greenhut purchased the estate sometime between 1906 and 1910, the exact date lost to incomplete records. He paid significantly less than McCall's construction cost, though the precise figure does not survive in accessible sources. He maintained the property, but used it more modestly than McCall had, treating it as a pleasant summer house rather than a stage for political theater. He rented it occasionally to other wealthy families who wanted a Jersey Shore season without the commitment of purchasing property. A small staff kept the house clean and the gardens maintained. Shadow Lawn passed from symbol of corruption to simple wealthy man's summer house, unremarkable among dozens of similar estates dotting the coast from Long Branch to Spring Lake. The property settled into quiet obscurity through the 1910s. Greenhut used it occasionally. Renters came and went. The house aged gracefully, well maintained but not lavishly updated. The scandal surrounding McCall faded as new scandals captured public attention. The Armstrong investigation led to reforms that changed the insurance industry, but those reforms happened in legislative chambers and corporate boardrooms, not at summer estates. Shadow Lawn became just another mansion, no longer infamous, simply expensive and somewhat unnecessary. Then came the summer of 1916, and Shadow Lawn briefly entered national prominence for reasons that had nothing to do with scandal or corruption. America hovered on the edge of war in June of 1916. Europe had been bleeding for 2 years, millions dying in trenches that stretched from the English Channel to Switzerland. Great Britain and France begged for American intervention. Germany warned against it. President Woodrow Wilson tried to keep the United States neutral, pursuing diplomatic solutions while preparing for the possibility that diplomacy would fail. The political pressure was enormous. Interventionists demanded that America join the Allies immediately. Isolationists insisted that European conflicts were none of America's business. Wilson needed rest. He needed distance from Washington's pressure and intrigue. His staff needed a base for his re-election campaign, somewhere with space for offices and meetings, but away from the capital's intensity. Someone suggested Shadow Lawn. The mansion was large enough to accommodate the president's household and staff. The location offered privacy and ocean breezes, yet remained close enough to New York and Washington for necessary travel. Greenhut agreed to lease the property for the summer. The financial terms were generous, though specific figures do not survive. On June 24, 1916, President Wilson arrived at Shadow Lawn, establishing what newspapers immediately began calling the Summer White House. Wilson conducted the nation's business from McCall's old mansion. He met with cabinet members in the library, where McCall had once entertained politicians who were now forgotten. Foreign diplomacy happened in the reception rooms. British and French representatives came to argue for intervention. German representatives came to argue for continued neutrality. Wilson listened to all of them while trying to navigate domestic politics that divided Americans into hostile camps. Campaign strategy sessions filled the evenings. Wilson was running for re-election against Charles Evans Hughes, ironically the same man who had led the Armstrong investigation that destroyed McCall. The campaign needed a message that would unite the party and appeal to voters who were deeply conflicted about the war. The slogan emerged that summer: "He kept us out of war." It was brilliant politics and questionable truth. Wilson had kept America out of the fighting so far, but he knew that neutrality was becoming impossible to maintain. German submarines were attacking American ships. American citizens had died when Germany sank the Lusitania. The situation was deteriorating in ways that might force Wilson's hand regardless of his preferences. But the campaign slogan was not about what might happen. It was about what had happened, and that record was clear. "He kept us out of war" appeared on banners, in speeches, in newspaper advertisements across the country. It was written at Shadow Lawn, spoken at Shadow Lawn. The estate that had symbolized corporate corruption 10 years earlier now represented presidential authority and America's attempt to avoid European entanglements. Wilson won re-election in November of 1916 by narrow margin. The message resonated with voters who feared sending their sons to die in foreign trenches. 5 months later, in April of 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. The circumstances had changed. German submarine attacks had intensified. The Zimmermann telegram had revealed German attempts to bring Mexico into the war against the United States. American neutrality was no longer tenable, but that betrayal of the campaign promise happened in Washington, not at Shadow Lawn. The mansion's brief moment of national significance ended with summer's close in 1916. Wilson returned to Washington. The Secret Service detail departed. Shadow Lawn returned to being just another wealthy man's property. Greenhut died in 1918. The exact circumstances of his death and what happened to Shadow Lawn immediately afterward remain unclear in surviving records. The property changed hands several times over the next 9 years, passing through owners whose names barely register in documents that county clerks filed and promptly forgot. None of these owners maintained the house with McCall's obsessive attention or used it with Wilson's historical purpose. The estate drifted through the 1920s. Still valuable as real estate, but no longer significant as symbol or setting for important events. The gardens slowly grew wild as maintenance budgets shrank. Paint peeled from window frames. Minor repairs went unaddressed. Shadow Lawn was aging, settling into the comfortable decline that eventually claims all houses when no one loves them quite enough to fight entropy. The mansion still stood, white columns facing the Atlantic, waiting for someone to decide its future. It would not wait much longer. 4:37 in the morning. A servant sleeping on the third floor of Shadow Lawn woke to the smell of smoke on June 10, 1927. She opened her door and saw flames consuming the hallway outside her room. She screamed. The sound woke other servants. Someone ran to telephone the fire department. Someone else tried to reach the owners, who were not in residence. The fire spread faster than anyone could comprehend. By the time the West Long Branch Fire Company arrived, flames were already visible through second-story windows. Firefighters connected hoses to hydrants and aimed water at the burning building, but the pressure was insufficient to reach the third floor where the fire had started. The ocean wind, which usually provided pleasant breezes on summer evenings, now pushed the blaze through the mansion's wooden interior with terrifying speed. The structure was well built, limestone exterior and solid construction, but the interior was wood and plaster and fabric, all of it dry from 24 summers and winters, all of it ready to burn. Companies from Eatontown and Long Branch sent equipment to help. Firefighters from 3 townships surrounded the mansion, pouring water onto flames that seemed to feed on their efforts. Nothing helped. The fire was too advanced, the building too large, the wind too strong. The roof collapsed first, around 5:30 in the morning, crashing through the third floor in an explosion of sparks and burning timber that sent flames shooting 100 feet into the air. The third floor followed within minutes, its floor joists burning through and dropping the entire level into the second floor below. The grand staircase where McCall had greeted guests and Wilson had descended for morning meetings buckled and fell into the basement, the wooden treads burning as they fell. Crystal chandeliers shattered from the heat before the flames even reached them. Marble cracked with sounds like gunshots as rapid temperature changes stressed the stone beyond endurance. Imported fixtures melted. The silk wallpaper that McCall had chosen because it came from China ignited and vanished in seconds. Room after room disappeared into flame and smoke. By dawn, when the fire finally exhausted its fuel, only the limestone foundation and portions of the exterior walls remained standing. Everything else was gone. The roof, the floors, the walls, the staircase, the fireplaces, the windows, all of it reduced to ash and twisted metal and chunks of stone that had fallen from their mortar beds. Firefighters had saved nothing. They walked through the ruins as the sun rose, checking for hot spots that might reignite, finding nothing worth saving. The mansion that had cost $1 million to build in 1903, that had housed a president in 1916, was gone. Total loss. The insurance adjusters would eventually determine that the fire started from electrical wiring that had been installed when such systems were new and dangerous. No one was blamed. No one was charged. It was simply the kind of disaster that happened when old buildings met modern conveniences. The owner at the time of the fire, a man whose name varies in different sources and who clearly had no deep attachment to the property, filed an insurance claim and walked away. The property sat vacant, 8 acres of scorched earth with blackened foundation stones and unstable walls that would cost a fortune to remove. Hubert Parson saw something others missed when he looked at those ruins in late summer of 1927. Most men his age, 56 years old, would have seen only problems and moved on to better opportunities. Parson saw potential. He was Canadian-born, naturalized American, president of F.W. Woolworth Company, commander of a retail empire that operated hundreds of stores across America and internationally. He had joined the five and dime business early in his career and risen through the ranks during the company's explosive growth, demonstrating the kind of merchandising instinct and operational discipline that built fortunes in retail. When founder Frank Woolworth died in 1919, the board chose Parson to lead. He had spent the 1920s expanding the Woolworth footprint, opening new stores, improving operations, watching the company's stock value soar with the rest of the market during the decade's prosperity. His compensation made him wealthy. His stock holdings made him rich. By the time Shadow Lawn burned, Parson commanded a fortune worth millions and an ego that demanded expression in limestone and steel. Hubert Parson had arrived in the world in 1871 in Canada, the son of a family whose ambitions pointed south toward American opportunity and whose resources were insufficient to make those ambitions reality without tremendous effort. He crossed the border as a young man seeking work in retail, an industry that required no formal education or social connections, just willingness to work long hours for modest wages and intelligence to recognize what customers wanted and how to provide it profitably. The Woolworth Company offered both opportunity and a model for success that Parson studied carefully. Frank Woolworth had transformed American retail by selling everything for 5 or 10 cents, creating stores where working families could afford small luxuries that made daily life more pleasant. The business model was simple but generated enormous profits when executed at scale. Woolworth built a skyscraper in Manhattan that bore his name, the tallest building in the world when it opened in 1913. A monument to the fortune that five and dime retail had created. Parson watched and learned. He absorbed Woolworth's lessons about volume and efficiency. He understood that small margins multiplied across millions of transactions generated wealth equal to any heavy industry or banking operation. He rose through management ranks, proving himself in increasingly responsible positions until the board recognized that he was the logical successor. If retail could build the world's tallest building, retail could build anything. He just needed the right opportunity to demonstrate that his personal success matched the company's achievements. Standing on the charred foundations of Shadow Lawn in late summer of 1927, Parson found his opportunity. The location was perfect, 8 acres of Atlantic oceanfront in West Long Branch, an established wealthy enclave where New York society had summered for generations. The scandal attached to McCall's name had faded after 20 years. The Wilson connection added prestige, a presidential pedigree that made the property historically significant. The fire had cleared away McCall's old-fashioned structure that would have required expensive updating. Parson could start fresh, building exactly what he wanted without compromise or constraint from existing architecture. The price was right. The seller wanted out. Parson purchased the property within weeks of the fire for a sum that records do not clearly document, but that was certainly far below what cleared oceanfront land would normally command. Then he hired Horace Trumbauer and gave the architect a single instruction: design something that would make every other mansion on the New Jersey shore look modest by comparison. Cost was not a concern. Quality was paramount. Timing was everything. Parson wanted to occupy his palace by 1929. Horace Trumbauer spread preliminary drawings across his Philadelphia office desk in late summer of 1927. 130 rooms, 108,000 square feet. $10.5 million. The numbers represented ambition on a scale that impressed even Trumbauer, and he had designed palaces for the wealthiest families in America. His clients included the Wideners, whose Pennsylvania estate Whitemarsh Hall contained 300 rooms on 300 acres. The Stotesburys, whose fortune from banking financed a mainline mansion that rivaled European royalty. The Elkinses, the Berwins, every great fortune in Philadelphia and beyond. He had created the Elms in Newport, a French chateau transported in concept to Rhode Island's most exclusive summer colony. He had planned the Widener Library at Harvard, a memorial that would outlast the family who funded it. At 59 years old, Horace Trumbauer was America's premier architect of Gilded Age excess, the man ultra-wealthy clients hired when they wanted grandeur that would outlast their lifetimes and impress their peers. Shadow Lawn would be one of his final great commissions, completed at the height of his powers, and at the end of an era that neither he nor Parson could see ending. Trumbauer worked in the Beaux-Arts style he had learned through intensive study of French classical architecture and design principles. He favored symmetrical compositions that created visual balance and announced order. His buildings featured monumental scale that overwhelmed visitors. He used limestone facades that would weather gracefully and maintain their color for centuries. His interiors featured marble and crystal and carved wood, materials that announced wealth through their mere presence. For Shadow Lawn, he designed a French neoclassical mansion that would rival anything built in America during the previous 50 years of Gilded Age construction. The facade would be white limestone, imported from quarries that supplied European palaces with stone that would never stain or discolor. Massive Corinthian columns would support a central portico, each column precisely proportioned according to classical ratios. A mansard roof with dormers would crown the structure, providing usable space on the top floor while creating the distinctive French silhouette. 3 stories above ground plus a full basement would house 130 rooms. The main floor would feature the public spaces where Parson would entertain. A grand entrance hall would rise through all 3 stories. The ballroom could accommodate 500 guests for dancing. A library with floor-to-ceiling carved woodwork would provide space for business meetings. A music room would allow intimate concerts. A billiard room would offer masculine refuge. A breakfast room would feature hand-painted murals depicting Italian landscapes. A dining room could seat 40 for formal meals. The second floor would contain the family bedrooms, 19 master suites, each with ensuite bathroom facilities. Parson would have his own suite, multiple rooms for dressing, sleeping, and conducting private business. The third floor would house additional bedrooms and servant quarters. An industrial-scale kitchen would occupy significant space. The grounds would feature formal Italian gardens with geometric beds, fountains with classical statuary, tennis courts, a swimming pool, greenhouses, and a multi-car garage. The estate would have its own power generation plant. Trumbauer employed talented designers in his office, including Julian Abele, an African-American architect whose contributions often went uncredited in an era when racial prejudice determined whose name appeared on buildings. The exact division of labor on Shadow Lawn remains unclear. Trumbauer's name went on the plans, but scholars suggest that Abele's technical sophistication contributed significantly to projects that bore only Trumbauer's name. Together, they created plans for a building that would cost more per square foot than anything in the residential market. Parson approved every detail. Construction began in autumn of 1927. Workers cleared the fire debris first, a task that took several weeks and required hauling away tons of charred timber and broken stone. They kept portions of McCall's original foundation where the limestone remained sound and stable, but expanded the footprint significantly to accommodate the much larger structure Trumbauer had designed. Steel framework began rising through winter and into spring of 1928. Carnegie Steel, or a similar major supplier, delivered beams, according to a schedule that kept construction moving forward without delays. The pace shocked observers, who were accustomed to construction projects that dragged on for years. Hundreds of workers labored simultaneously at different elevations, each trade working in coordination with others so that no one waited for prior work to finish completely. Bricklayers followed steel workers up the building like a rising tide, creating walls on lower floors while steel was still being installed above them. Electricians pulled wire through conduits while plasterers finished walls on completed sections. Marble setters placed Italian Carrara stone in the entrance hall, while carpenters carved wooden panels for the library 2 floors above. The logistics required military precision and ruthless efficiency. Materials arrived from suppliers precisely when needed, not before to create storage problems or after to cause delays. Cranes positioned beams before concrete below had fully cured, calculating precisely how much strength was necessary before the next layer could be safely added. Nothing waited, nothing wasted. Time was money, and Parson was paying for both. The exterior walls began enclosing the steel frame by summer of 1928. White limestone cladding transformed the utilitarian skeleton into a palace that gleamed in the sun. The massive columns at the entrance rose from foundations designed to support weight that would stand for centuries. French windows with elaborate frames punctured every floor. The mansard roof took shape, dormers providing light to third-floor rooms while creating the silhouette that announced French influence. By autumn of 1928, the structure was weather-tight. Trumbauer's craftsmen installed marble floors in patterns that required precise cutting and fitting. Crystal chandeliers imported from Europe arrived in crates packed with straw. Mahogany woodwork was carved and fitted. Gold leaf detailing on plaster moldings required artisans who had trained in techniques that dated back centuries. The breakfast room received hand-painted murals. The ballroom's ceiling rose 2 stories, decorated with elaborate plasterwork. Master bedrooms received ensuite bathrooms with imported fixtures. Outside, landscape architects created formal gardens in the Italian style. Geometric beds separated by gravel paths created order and symmetry. Fountains with classical statuary anchored major sight lines. The tennis courts went in south of the main house. The swimming pool occupied a terrace overlooking the ocean. Greenhouses allowed year-round cultivation of exotic plants. The garage could house 10 automobiles or more. Every element announced that money was no object. Spring of 1929 arrived. Workers completed the final details. Parson moved furniture into 130 rooms, some pieces custom-made for specific spaces, and others antiques purchased from European dealers. Paintings went on walls. Carpets covered marble floors in rooms where stone seemed too cold. The staff moved into their quarters and began learning the routines that would make the mansion function. Shadow Lawn rose white and perfect above the Atlantic in spring of 1929, gleaming limestone and crystal, $10.5 million frozen in stone and steel, 108,000 square feet of the most expensive residential space in America. Parson had created exactly what he envisioned, a palace that proved retail fortune equaled any other kind of wealth. The construction timeline of 18 months from fire to completion seemed reckless, but the speed had killed no workers, a remarkable achievement for a project of this scale. Parson was ready to enjoy what he had built. 6 months later, on October 29, 1929, the stock market collapsed and the world changed forever. Visitors entering through Shadow Lawn's main doors in summer of 1929 encountered a space designed to overwhelm the senses and announce wealth without subtlety. The entrance hall rose 3 stories, walls sheathed in Italian marble veined in gold that caught light and created an impression of warmth despite the stone's cold reality. The grand staircase curved upward in a sweep of white stone, each step precisely measured. Bronze railings catching light from a chandelier that hung from the third-floor ceiling. The floor gleamed with polished granite arranged in geometric patterns, black and white and gray creating designs that drew the eye toward the staircase. Every surface announced that this was not an ordinary house. This was architecture as assertion of dominance. The walls were not simply marble, but specifically Italian Carrara, chosen for color and quality from quarries that had supplied Renaissance palaces. The chandeliers were not simply crystal, but specifically from European workshops. Even the air smelled expensive, furniture polish and fresh flowers, and the particular scent that comes from spaces maintained so carefully that nothing ever decays. The ballroom occupied most of the mansion's east wing on the first floor. The space could accommodate 500 guests for dancing, with room remaining for an orchestra on a raised platform. The floors were inlaid wood, different species creating patterns that professional dancers appreciated. French doors opened onto a terrace where people could step outside to escape the crowd and enjoy ocean breezes while looking at formal gardens illuminated by electric lights hidden among the plantings. The library featured floor-to-ceiling shelves of carved mahogany, the wood selected for grain and color. Leather-bound books filled the shelves, arranged by size and color rather than subject matter, because this was a library designed for display rather than scholarship. A massive table occupied the center of the room, its surface large enough to spread architectural drawings or business documents. Leather chairs provided seating for 8 or 10 men who would gather here to discuss Woolworth Company business. The music room held a grand piano of German manufacture. Seating arranged in semicircle would accommodate audiences for intimate concerts when Parson hired professional musicians to entertain guests. The billiard room offered masculine refuge with leather chairs the color of tobacco, a billiard table imported from England, and walls decorated with hunting prints. The breakfast room's murals depicted idealized Italian countryside, peasants harvesting grapes in landscapes bathed in perpetual golden sunlight. The dining room could seat 40 guests at a table that required 8 footmen to serve properly. Parson maintained his own suite on the second floor, occupying space equal to an entire modest house. Multiple bedrooms gave him rooms for dressing, sleeping, and conducting private business. The views stretched across the Atlantic to the horizon. Bathrooms featured fixtures of nickel and porcelain. Closets the size of normal bedrooms held his wardrobe. The Woolworth Company president had created a home that rivaled anything built by railroad magnates or banking families. Operating Shadow Lawn required an army of servants whose labor made luxury possible. The staff numbered between 50 and 75, depending on the season and whether the family was in residence or entertaining guests. A butler managed the household, overseeing all other servants and ensuring that the mansion operated according to standards that would satisfy Parson. A chef commanded the kitchen, supervising 8 to 12 cooks and assistants who prepared meals for family, guests, and staff. The kitchen operated like a restaurant, producing multiple menus simultaneously. Footmen and valets numbered 6 to 10, responsible for serving meals with European formality, maintaining wardrobes, and attending to male guests. Chambermaids, 10 to 15 women, cleaned 130 rooms on rotating schedules that ensured every surface remained polished and every bed was made with fresh linens daily. Laundresses handled mountains of sheets, towels, tablecloths, napkins, and clothing. Groundskeepers, 10 to 15 men, maintained 8 acres of formal gardens, tennis courts that required daily attention, the swimming pool that needed filtering and chemical treatment, and all the exterior surfaces that salt air tried to corrode. Chauffeurs kept automobiles ready for trips to Manhattan or drives along the shore, each vehicle washed and polished daily. Night watchmen patrolled the property to prevent theft or vandalism. Maintenance workers handled the heating system that warmed 130 rooms through New Jersey winters. the electrical plant that powered lights and modern conveniences, and the plumbing that served bathrooms and kitchens. The mansion required labor equivalent to a small hotel, dozens of people working constantly to create the impression that luxury happened effortlessly. Fresh flowers appeared throughout the mansion daily, arrangements changed by staff who removed yesterday's blooms and replaced them with new selections from the greenhouses. Meals followed European service style, multiple courses delivered by footmen who had trained in the formal patterns of upper-class dining. Cleaning schedules ensured that no room ever showed dust or disorder. The grounds remained immaculate, every hedge trimmed to precise shape, every path swept clear of leaves, every fountain operating. Automobiles sat in the garage with tanks full and chrome polished, ready whenever Parson wanted transportation. The machinery of privilege operated invisibly, servants moving through back stairs and service corridors so that the family and guests never witnessed the labor. Parson entertained on a scale that matched the architecture and announced his arrival among America's elite. Grand balls brought 300 to 500 guests, society figures from New York mixing with New Jersey locals and Woolworth Company executives and their families. Orchestras played in the ballroom, professional musicians hired for the evening. Champagne flowed despite Prohibition's theoretical restrictions, bootleggers providing quality French vintages to customers who had money and who did not care that federal law prohibited alcohol consumption. Women wore gowns from Paris, the latest fashions that cost more than most Americans earned in months. Men wore white tie and tails, the formal evening dress that signaled upper-class status. The parties lasted until dawn. Guests departing as sun rose over the Atlantic, and servants began cleaning the damage that 500 people had inflicted on the mansion. Dinner parties offered more intimate gatherings, 20 or 30 guests for elaborate multi-course meals that showcased the chef's skills and allowed serious conversation. These dinners were carefully orchestrated, seating arrangements designed to put compatible people together. Garden parties in summer took advantage of the grounds, croquet and tennis and swimming, followed by buffets on the terraces where guests could serve themselves from tables loaded with food. Holiday celebrations, particularly Christmas and New Year's, became annual events that the local newspapers covered in society pages. Business entertaining served strategic purposes that were more important than pure social pleasure. Woolworth executives and major stockholders received invitations regularly. Politicians whose votes affected commercial regulation enjoyed weekend visits. Shadow Lawn functioned as both home and business tool, just as McCall had used it 30 years earlier. The timing could not have been worse. Parson completed Shadow Lawn in spring of 1929, moved in with his family, began the entertaining and the business. The stock market crashed that October. Black Thursday, October 24th. Black Tuesday, October 29th. The dates became markers of catastrophe. Woolworth stock, which had soared through the 1920s as the company expanded, collapsed along with everything else. Parson's paper wealth evaporated in days. The company remained profitable in fundamental ways. People still needed five-and-dime stores during hard times, but the expansion ended. Stock that had been worth substantial sums became worth fractions of prior value. The Depression made lavish parties seem obscene when bread lines formed in cities. Parson continued using Shadow Lawn, but the golden age lasted less than a year before economic reality changed everything. On January 15, 1933, Hubert Templeton Parson died in his bedroom on Shadow Lawn's second floor. He was 61 years old. Heart failure, the doctors said, though stress and disappointment certainly contributed. He had built the most expensive private residence in America and enjoyed it for less than 4 years. His widow inherited the mansion and the impossible burden of maintaining it. The bills arrived every week at Shadow Lawn. Envelopes containing invoices that documented the cost of luxury during the Great Depression. 57 servants remained on payroll, their combined salaries reaching thousands of dollars monthly, when millions of Americans had no employment at all. Coal for heating 130 rooms through New Jersey winters, the mansion's furnaces consuming tons of anthracite. Groundskeepers maintaining 8 acres of formal gardens, property taxes on an estate assessed at millions of dollars. Insurance premiums for a mansion filled with European antiques and imported fixtures. Parson's widow opened each invoice and calculated how long the money would last. Woolworth stock had crashed with the rest of the market. Parson's estate included substantial holdings, but converting stock to cash during the Depression meant accepting devastating losses. The mansion cost hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to maintain properly. Even reduced income from Woolworth dividends could not support those expenses indefinitely. The arithmetic simply did not work. She tried selling first, the logical solution when you own something too expensive to keep. Shadow Lawn went on the market in 1933. Real estate agents prepared descriptions emphasizing the oceanfront location, the Horace Trumbauer design, the presidential connection from Wilson's summer residence, the 130 rooms. They contacted wealthy families whose fortunes had survived the crash. They advertised in newspapers. They brought potential buyers to view the property. The asking price dropped from millions to hundreds of thousands as months passed without acceptable offers. No one bought. Who could afford it? Ultra-wealthy families were retrenching, not expanding. The Depression had frozen the market for luxury real estate. Mansions across the country sat empty. Shadow Lawn was particularly problematic. The operating costs were public knowledge. Everyone understood that purchasing the mansion meant committing to hundreds of thousands in annual expenses. She explored alternatives when selling failed. Could the mansion convert to a hotel or resort? She commissioned market research that suggested tourists were not visiting the New Jersey shore in numbers that would support operation of a 130-room facility. Could the mansion become a school or hospital? She approached administrators. The conversion costs were prohibitive. Millions of dollars to install necessary equipment. The institutions had no money. Could the government use it? Various proposals circulated. Every proposal died in budget discussions. Every option failed. Every plan collapsed against the reality that Shadow Lawn represented a kind of excess that the Depression had made obsolete. She began cutting costs in 1935 when it became clear that no solution would emerge quickly. The staff shrank from 50 or 60 down to 30, then to 20, then to 10. Footmen were let go. Most of the maids left. Only essential positions remained: a caretaker who lived on property, a groundskeeper who maintained the most visible portions, a cook, a few cleaners. Most of the mansion's rooms closed off entirely. Furniture was covered with sheets to protect it from dust and sunlight. Heat was turned off to save coal. The effect was ghostly, a palace designed for hundreds now occupied by a handful of people. The gardens began reverting to wild, formal beds becoming overgrown. Tennis courts cracked. The swimming pool went unmaintained, tiles loosening and water growing green. Deferred maintenance accumulated like compound interest. The roof needed repairs where winter storms had damaged slates. Plumbing leaked in bathrooms no one used. Windows cracked from temperature changes, and no one replaced them. Paint peeled from window frames exposed to salt air. Each problem got postponed because solving it cost money the estate did not have. By 1939, Parson's widow had stopped pretending she could maintain the property at any level. The borough of West Long Branch filed liens for unpaid property taxes. Thousands of dollars that had gone unpaid for multiple years. Utility companies demanded payment. Insurance companies threatened to cancel policies. She could not abandon the estate legally because liability laws made property owners responsible for dangerous conditions. But she could not afford to keep it either. Shadow Lawn had become what real estate agents called a white elephant. Property worth less than the cost of maintaining or demolishing it. The borough considered seizing it for unpaid taxes. But what would the borough do with 130 rooms and 8 acres? The problem had no solution that any party could afford. The mansion sat, slowly deteriorating, waiting. The windows on the 3rd floor of Shadow Lawn stood open to winter wind in 1945. Inside the mansion, snow drifted across ballroom floors where 500 guests had danced 16 years earlier. No one had closed those windows when autumn turned cold. No one lived in the house to notice or care. The estate had passed to the Borough of Eatontown through foreclosure for unpaid taxes sometime in the early 1940s. The borough had no use for a mansion and no money to maintain it. Shadow Lawn became an abandoned building. subject to weather and vandalism and theft. Water damage appeared first, the inevitable result of broken windows and damaged roof letting rain and snow inside. Ceilings collapsed where water pooled on floors above, plaster saturated beyond its weight capacity, crashing onto floors that had been polished daily. Mold spread across walls in black and green patterns. The grand staircase's wooden elements rotted where water reached them. Floors warped and buckled. The heating system froze and burst during the first unheated winter. Electrical wiring became hazardous. Vandals found the mansion next. Teenagers from West Long Branch and Eatontown used it as hangout, breaking more windows for entertainment, spray painting graffiti on marble walls, smashing mirrors and glass doors because destruction was thrilling. Homeless men sheltered in rooms that still had partial roofs, burning furniture and fireplaces to stay warm through winter nights. The damage was random and pointless, destruction for its own sake. Thieves came with purpose and tools and trucks. They pried Italian marble mantels from walls, loading them onto vehicles to sell to salvage dealers who asked no questions. Crystal chandeliers disappeared piece by piece. Mahogany woodwork vanished from the library. Panels carefully removed with crowbars and saws. Copper plumbing and electrical wiring got stripped for scrap metal value. Gold leaf detailing was scraped from moldings. Bathroom fixtures disappeared. Doors came off hinges. Hardware, light fixtures, anything portable and valuable got carried out. Shadow Lawn was being dismembered, its valuable architectural elements scattered while the building died. Developers proposed converting the ruins to a hotel in the mid-1940s, seeing opportunity in oceanfront property. Cost estimates killed that plan before serious work began. The mansion needed millions of dollars in repairs before anyone could occupy it safely. Another proposal suggested creating a private club where members would share costs. That also failed. Some accounts suggest military use during World War II, temporary housing or offices for personnel stationed nearby. Documentation is sparse. If soldiers used Shadow Lawn, they left it in worse condition. The borough considered demolition repeatedly through the late 1940s and early 1950s. Municipal officials wanted the eyesore gone. They commissioned estimates from contractors. The numbers shocked them. Tearing down the mansion would cost $500,000 or more. The structure was massive. The limestone blocks weighed tons each. Asbestos insulation made demolition hazardous and expensive. The foundation alone would require specialized equipment to remove. $500,000 to destroy a building the borough had acquired for unpaid taxes that totaled far less. The arithmetic made no sense. Demolition was more expensive than abandonment. Shadow Lawn survived not because anyone wanted to preserve it, but because destroying it cost too much. The mansion stood through the 1950s as monument to the Gilded Age's collapse. Proof that excess built without consideration for maintenance costs eventually became burden no one could carry. By 1956, demolition seemed certain. The Borough of Eatontown wanted it gone. Contractors were preparing new estimates. Then a small college in need of space made an unlikely offer that changed everything. Monmouth Junior College had 350 students and no permanent campus in 1956. The college operated from rented spaces scattered across Long Branch, New Jersey. Classrooms in church basements and office buildings in converted houses. Founded in 1933 as a 2-year institution serving students who could not afford to leave home for university, Monmouth had grown steadily through the 1940s and 50s as returning veterans used GI Bill benefits. Enrollment was increasing every year. The scattered facilities created problems with scheduling, administration, student services, and institutional identity. The college needed to consolidate. Administrators began looking at available properties in Monmouth County. Land was expensive. New construction was expensive. The college's budget was limited, funded primarily through modest tuition and small amounts of state aid. They needed space but could not afford to pay market rates. Then someone mentioned the abandoned mansion in West Long Branch, the ruin that everyone said was worthless, but that still occupied 8 acres of land. A delegation visited Shadow Lawn in spring of 1956. They saw disaster. Broken windows throughout all 3 floors, collapsed ceilings in multiple rooms, water damage visible everywhere, stripped fixtures and stolen woodwork, entire rooms reduced to bare walls, graffiti spray painted on marble. Trash and debris accumulated from years of vandalism. Structural engineers would need to evaluate whether the building was even salvageable. But the delegation also saw potential. The location was excellent, 8 acres in West Long Branch, close to other population centers. The building, if it could be saved, offered far more space than the college could afford to build new. 130 rooms could house administrative offices, faculty offices, meeting rooms, perhaps some classrooms. The price was right. The Borough of Eatontown wanted the property gone and would accept almost any reasonable offer. Negotiations proceeded through spring and early summer of 1956. The purchase price landed around $250,000. Compared to the $10.5 million Parson had spent in 1929, the college acquired Shadow Lawn for approximately 2% of construction cost. But the risk was enormous. If structural engineers found the damage too severe, Monmouth would own a ruin it could not afford to demolish. But if the building could be saved, Monmouth would have a campus centerpiece that no other small college could match. The college chose to rename the property immediately, even before they knew if it could be saved. They called it Woodrow Wilson Hall, honoring the presidential connection from 1916 rather than Parson's brief ownership or the Shadow Lawn name that carried associations with scandal and failure. The Wilson name gave academic legitimacy. It connected the building to national history rather than Gilded Age excess. The name stuck. Today, most people who know the building call it Wilson Hall. Structural engineers evaluated the mansion through summer of 1956, crawling through damaged spaces to assess whether the fundamental structure remained sound. Their report, delivered in late summer, offered cautious optimism. The steel frame remained sound, protected by the concrete and masonry that surrounded it. The limestone exterior walls needed repair but were structurally stable. The foundation showed no major cracks or settling. The damage was severe but not fatal. With extensive work and substantial investment, Shadow Lawn could be converted to educational use. The engineers detailed what would be required. Asbestos would need professional abatement. The electrical system required complete replacement. Plumbing needed total reconstruction. The roof needed repair or replacement. Water damage remediation would take months. Windows needed replacement or extensive repair. Heating systems needed installation. But it could be done. The building could be saved. Conversion planning began immediately in autumn of 1956. The ballroom would become an assembly hall for lectures and student gatherings. Large bedrooms would convert to administrative offices. Some spaces could serve as classrooms, though the configuration was not ideal for teaching. The kitchen would need industrial equipment. Servant quarters could provide storage or mechanical rooms. The challenge was balancing preservation of historic features against the practical needs of a functioning educational institution. Restoration. Work started in autumn of 1956 with the first priority being to make the building weathertight. Contractors repaired the roof, replacing damaged sections and ceiling leaks. Windows throughout the mansion got replaced or repaired. That work allowed interior restoration to proceed through winter without further weather damage. Electrical contractors installed modern wiring. Plumbers replaced every pipe. Heating engineers designed a system that could warm the massive structure. Asbestos abatement crews removed hazardous materials. Structural repairs stabilized floors and ceilings. The college made difficult decisions about what to preserve and what to sacrifice in service of functionality. They kept the exterior facade intact. The grand staircase remained. Major marble work stayed where it had not been stolen. The ballroom's proportions and plasterwork were preserved where possible. But interior configurations changed substantially. Rooms were subdivided. Modern drop ceilings covered damaged plaster. Fluorescent lighting replaced missing chandeliers. The building simplified, losing many of Trumbauer's ornamental details in favor of functionality. By autumn of 1957, Woodrow Wilson Hall opened for classes. Students climbed the grand staircase that Parson had descended 28 years earlier. The ballroom where society had danced became a space where freshmen gathered for orientation. Administrative offices occupied bedrooms that had been designed for weekend guests. The transformation was complete. Shadowlawn had found new purpose. The mansion built for one family now served hundreds of students. The building that had nearly been demolished became the centerpiece of a growing college. Monmouth Junior College became Monmouth College in 1956 when it began offering four-year degrees. Later, it became Monmouth University as graduate programs were added. Enrollment grew from hundreds to thousands. The campus expanded with new construction, dormitories, and academic buildings spreading across property the university acquired. But Wilson Hall remained the symbolic center, the building that appeared in promotional materials, the space where important university events occurred. The university invested in ongoing maintenance, understanding that preserving the structure was both responsibility and opportunity. In 1978, Woodrow Wilson Hall received designation on the National Register of Historic Places, the federal government's official list of buildings worthy of preservation. The recognition provided legal protection against demolition or major exterior alteration. The designation acknowledged the building's architectural and historical significance, both as example of Horace Trumbauer's Beaux-Arts design and as presidential summer residence. The listing imposed requirements for how the university could modify the structure, but it also provided access to grants and tax incentives for preservation. The university embarked on systematic restoration campaigns through the 1980s and 90s, investing millions of dollars in preserving and improving the building. Exterior stonework received professional cleaning, removing decades of pollution and salt air damage. Windows were restored with period-appropriate materials where possible. The roof required complete replacement, a project costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Landscaping improved around the building. Major exterior restoration came in the 2000s as the building approached its 100th anniversary. The university hired conservation specialists and stonemasons trained in historical methods. They repaired the facade, replacing damaged blocks and repointing mortar. Columns received stabilization. The mansard roof got new slate tiles. Window frames were restored or replicated. The project cost millions, funded through university budgets, alumni donations, and preservation grants. The result was an exterior that looked as Trumbauer had intended, white limestone gleaming above Norwood Avenue. Interior restoration proceeded more selectively. The university restored the entrance hall and grand staircase to near original condition. Marble was cleaned and repaired. Some plasterwork was restored. A few chandeliers were brought back, either originals recovered from antique markets or period-appropriate reproductions. But most of the interior remained functional office space with modern finishes. The limestone facade glows white above Norwood Avenue today, visible from blocks away. Students cross the grounds toward Woodrow Wilson Hall's columned entrance. The building houses the university president's office, senior administrative staff, development and alumni relations offices, and board of trustees meeting rooms. It functions as the university's symbolic and administrative center, hosting special events, receptions, and fundraising galas. Operating the building requires constant vigilance. Ocean proximity accelerates deterioration. Salt air corrodes metals and degrades stone. Storms threaten a structure with massive roof surface area. The roof requires constant monitoring. Limestone naturally erodes, requiring specialized masons. Window seals fail regularly. The foundation remains stable but gets monitored annually. Annual maintenance costs run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Specialized repairs cost significantly more. Heating and cooling 130 rooms consumes energy on industrial scale. The university must balance preservation requirements against competing priorities. What survived from Parson's mansion? The exterior remains almost entirely original Trumbauer design. The structural core, steel frame, and limestone walls endured abandonment and conversion. Major architectural spaces like the ballroom and entrance hall kept their proportions. The grand staircase survived. Some marble remained. Some woodwork survived theft. What was lost? Most interior configurations changed. All of Parson's furniture and decorations disappeared. Much ornamental plaster was destroyed. Gold leaf detailing vanished. The stolen marble mantels never returned. The formal Italian gardens were replaced with simplified campus landscaping. Outbuildings were demolished. The swimming pool was filled. The tennis courts were paved over. The ambiance of private palace became institutional building. Public access to Woodrow Wilson Hall is limited. The university does not offer regular public tours. Researchers can request appointments. Occasionally, the university opens Wilson Hall for community events. The exterior remains visible from public streets, but this is not a museum. It is a functioning university building where preservation serves education. Two mansions rose on 8 acres of New Jersey oceanfront. John McCall's original stood 24 years from 1903 to 1927, before fire destroyed it in a single morning. Hubert Parson's rebuild has survived 95 years from 1929 to today by becoming something neither builder imagined. McCall built Shadow Lawn to announce his arrival among the elite. Scandal destroyed him before he could enjoy it for more than 3 summers. Parson built the grandest private residence in America to immortalize his retail success. The Great Depression made his monument obsolete before he finished unpacking. Woodrow Wilson used Shadow Lawn for 1 summer to conduct the nation's business and win re-election. The building survived all of them, outliving its creators and original purposes and the era that made such excess possible. Parson wanted permanence. He got it, but not the way he planned. His Woolworth fortune vanished as stock values collapsed. His name faded from memory, but his building endures because Monmouth University found use for all that limestone and steel. The mansion designed to house one family now serves thousands of students annually. The palace built to display retail wealth became headquarters for educational institution. Architecture outlasted fortune. Stone outlasted money. The building endured by transforming. Most Gilded Age mansions did not survive. Whitemarsh Hall was demolished in 1980 despite having 300 rooms. The Elms in Newport survived only through museum preservation. Dozens of other Trumbauer designs vanished. Shadow Lawn survived partly through luck, partly because demolition was too expensive. But it survived primarily because Monmouth University committed to preservation through use. Woodrow Wilson Hall operates Monday through Friday. Administrative offices closing at 5 o'clock. The building that Hubert Parson designed to outlast his retail fortune now serves different purpose entirely. Horace Trumbauer's limestone facade still catches the Atlantic light exactly as it did in 1929. White columns rising against New Jersey sky. The building endured when fortunes disappeared, when families faded, when the age that created such excess ended permanently. The purpose changed, but the architecture remains. Stone and steel outlasting money and ambition, dissolving into the sky as Trumbauer intended, serving thousands where it once served one. Surviving because someone found another use for all that ambition frozen in limestone.